It's a pleasure to be here yet again for the Fleet Street Quarter Business Improvement District sponsored lectures that we have here in Dr. Johnson's house, and nice to see some faithful followers of the lecture series as well as lots of new people as well. This is a particularly Fleet Street Quarter centric talk, the First Lady of Fleet Street. So not only does the whole area have associations with journalism, of course, but so does Samuel Johnson, best remembered for his dictionary, but he really forged his early career. And much of the time that he was working here in the house on the dictionary, he was still producing journalism work. Just to have a few pennies at the end of each week, he'd be sending at least 2 articles off to various journals such as the Rambler, the Idler, earlier in his career, the Gentleman's Magazine as well. But it's a very brave new world of female journalism in the 19th and 20th century that we're here to talk about today. And our speaker is here to discuss this. She has a great background as a City of London guide and has been taking people through the streets of London for well over a decade now. And her understanding of London and its history goes back at least 2,000 years. Is that right, Tina? Yes, at least. Well, you are fabulous, yes. So if you could just join me in welcoming Tina for the Fleet Street.
Thank you, everybody. All right, let's go. Here she is, Rachel Beer, the First Lady of Fleet Street. Born 1858 and 1927. Can you all hear me all right? Good. Just a little background about the period. You probably all know what it must have been like then to be a woman in Fleet Street, or can guess. But by the time she was editing the 2 newspapers, The Observer and the Sunday Times, the women were still denied the vote. She became the first woman to edit not 1 but 2 national British newspapers. And unlike her male counterpart, she was banned from London clubs, not because of anything she did, but we all know it was men only. The press gallery at the House of Commons, although I understood there was a small gallery where ladies could go discreetly to watch the proceedings. The editors preferred men for the rough and tumble of outside reporting, and ladies were generally restricted to the women's sphere. But she managed to raise a formidable voice on national and political views. And I've read a few. Obviously, when I started this, I did the Fleet Street Women walk many years ago for International Women's Day, and I picked up on Rachel then, and she was just a small paragraph to begin with, and then became a whole talk. But I do read up about her because there is actually not very much of basically first-hand evidence of a lot of things that she did. We do have a few things on the slides, but it's said that she had a very strong viewpoint, but not always one that everyone might agree with. And she also, it suggested that she didn't really research her topics very well. She sort of went off half-baked, but then again, when you actually edit 2 newspapers, I think you can probably get away with it. And when you think what we're reading today, it was probably a bit more readable than some of the things we have. So how did this all come about? Her origins, absolutely fascinating. A daughter of the Sassoon family who hailed from Mesopotamia, today's Iraq, and the city of Baghdad. They were Sephardic Jews. Her great-grandfather was the Nazi to the Pasha, basically in translation, the chief treasurer. And in the 18th century Jewish community in Iraq was heavily influenced by their Arab neighbours, which is in a way a story all on its own, isn't it, when you think about the situation that we have today. And they also adopted the dress and the cuisine. They were liberal-minded, and their object was to be fruitful and multiply. And so they did. David, her father, was one of several sons who was sent to Bombay. Very like the Rothschild family, the patriarch would send the sons off to various places in the East The Rothschilds, of course, covered Europe to see what they could do to create the family's fortune. They were initially rather cautious in Bombay because it was a completely different culture. But as the East India Trading Company's monopoly was curtailed, they did very well in export and import, and they became involved in the opium trade, which was basically the making of their fortune. We fast forward a bit more, fast forward to London. After 40 years in India, the Sassoon family made their home in England. David came over to purchase Ashley Park near Walton-on-Thames, and Rachel was only, I think, about 2.5. She'd been born in Bombay and she was about 2.5, 3 when she arrived in London. They were very well received. They were extremely wealthy. They lived at the best addresses, as I said, country mansions and a knighthood in the family, and accepted into society. Although accepted in English society, they did maintain at home their Eastern identity by the use of their Iraqi names in private, and a lot of their correspondence apparently was in Judeo-Arabic, and they retained their Jewish faith. And also they were mixing with the other wealthy Jewish communities and became connected to the Rothschilds through marriage. The beautiful Rachel, who you see here with my little sweetheart, grew up to be a beautiful young woman, intelligent, strong and independent. I understand she was homeschooled, but she was determined to lead a purposeful and useful life, and initially got involved in charity work, but actually did train as a nurse at Brompton Hospital and actually did work there. Sadly, Rachel's father, David, died when she was still quite young, and her mother, Flora, then had the job of getting her married off. They had no intention of arranging a marriage for her. In this family, it was the sons of the family who were responsible for preserving and multiplying not only the family wealth, but their future. There was no shortage of suitors, but she wasn't going to have any of them. So we now go back one. She actually did meet the love of her life, Frederick Beer. That's not the De Beers, don't get mixed up with diamonds. These are the Beers Sukenna. They were the prosperous innkeepers in Frankfurt through their ancestors dating back to the 16th century. They were also Hofjuden, which is the court Jews, finding finance for the German princes and dukes. It puts their standing way ahead of the Rothschilds and the Sassoons by 2 centuries. Their position in the court exempted them from anti-Jewish decrees, and they were Ashkenazi Jews. Frederick's father, Julius, had arrived in London penniless, it would seem, and he went to work for the London Stock Exchange and sold stocks and shares in the newfangled American railroad companies, eventually making his fortune through the railways from the American Civil War and the cotton crisis. He was Beer, who was the financier to governments, not kings, and he made a tidy fortune. Frederick's father, Julius, married out of the faith and had his children baptized Anglicans, moving beyond the Jewish faith. And people often wonder why, but I think it could be quite obvious. He chose to convert in order to integrate into a secular society, to improve the future for his family. Frederick's name is also unusual as it's not a family name, once again moving away from the Jewish tradition. Now, Frederick's father bought the Observer in 1870 with a consortium, but he ended up being the sole proprietor. For the next 3 decades, the oldest newspaper would remain in the Beer family. On Julius's early death, his son Frederick became the sole heir and proprietor of the paper, aged 23. No one knows when Frederick met Rachel. There just doesn't seem to be any record, no letters, no particular event. But meet they did, And they, from what I understand from the information that we have, is that they were equals. They were both the same age. They were just under 30, which is actually quite late for Rachel to marry. And they had both completed what you might say their own quest. He had been travelling, she had been nursing at the hospital. And they just enjoyed each other's company. And she accepted his proposal of marriage. I don't really know what her mother thought but at that point, but when Rachel converted to Christianity the day before her wedding, I think we know what happened with her family. They ostracized her and would not be in contact with her for some time. So now we move on to the Observer and the Sunday Times. So Frederick and Rachel kept a fabulous house, and I've forgotten where it is now, Chesterfield Square, I think, Chesterfield Street. Lots of fun, lots of parties, lots of fancy dress. But they were always interested in doing something and doing something good. They liked to be occupied. So the move from philanthropy to journalism to activism may seem natural to us today, but women who worked for newspapers were generally confined to domestic topics. Rachel was not adverse to domestic topics, but she really wanted to get her teeth into something. So her husband owned the Observer, and Rachel would pop into the office. And the Fleet Street gossip was that the proprietor's wife was poking her nose into the editor's business. Several editors resigned. But by 1891, she had taken over as editor. Her husband, Frederick, had become ill. Initially, it was assumed it was tuberculosis. So in 1891 was when she became the first female editor of a national newspaper. And 2 years later, she purchased the Sunday Times. At first, I thought it had been Frederick who had bought the paper, but I checked my facts, and it was actually Rachel who purchased the paper. She wanted one that she could work on her own. Again, a veteran newspaper of general interest with a long history of upheavals, ready for change. She was, however, not the first female owner. The first female owner was Miss Alice Cornwall, who had been a barmaid, who then went off to Australia and made an absolute killing in gold mining. So there we go, another great story of a woman who she had humble beginnings. Anyway, Rachel liked her new newspaper and would write every week an editorial called The World's Work, which is quite a big thing to cover, I would have said. But it was her way to express her own views and topics. Her range was very wide, apparently, including, of course, better conditions for the working class and, of course, equality for women. So, as always, the women's position in journalism is precarious, but she did have brilliant editors working with her as well. Again, as I said earlier, she was not considered a brilliant editor, known for her occasional flair and business-like decisions. But I have a funny feeling a man might have written that, don't you think? Sorry, gentlemen. So by the 1890s, there were several successful women's magazines and journals, and saw the rise of editorial written by women for women. In 1893, the Society of Women's Journalists was founded. It had 200 members, including Rachel, out of a total of 660 women journalists. So that's actually quite a lot of women. Again, Rachel was at a huge disadvantage. She didn't know the clubby people. She had no university education. She was deprived of tip-offs and networking contacts. But she had returned to the first tradition of newspapers being the editor and the owner. Of course, some of you may know of the Daily Courant, which there's a plaque down at Ludgate Hill, which also ended up being run by a woman. She learnt from the best editors of the day, William Stead, and they wanted the press to be the eye and the ear of the people. They were well known for their relentless campaigns to effect change in government. Steed's approach went hand in hand with Rachel's own activities and her disapproval of MPs' idleness and the hardships of the working poor. She preferred to work from home, Chesterfield Gardens, and she had offices created in her property and a telephone link to Fleet Street, which was pioneering in itself. And she preferred to write everything by hand. She never had a secretary or a typewriter. And friends often noted that when they had parties or dinner parties, her fingers were all blue. Her writing hand was absolutely covered in ink. And of course, she was the envy of Fleet Street when she became involved in the Dreyfus affair. Have I gone one ahead? Can you see that all right? Yes. In 1898, she personally obtained a confession from Ferdinand Esterhazy, the French major and German agent who had forged the document, setting out military secrets that Captain Alfred Dreyfus had allegedly passed on to the Germans. This had been the basis of the case against Dreyfus. It's far more complicated, and you can obviously always go and look it up. In what became known as the Dreyfus affair, Rachel always believed that it was also a miscarriage of justice and anti-Semitism, which I'm sure it was actually at that time in France. And Rachel published successive articles relating to Esterhazy, which led to calls for a retrial for Dreyfus. However, she thought she'd got his confession, but he then retracted it and sued the Observer for libel. But she persisted, and there is a fascinating story when I think the whole of France kept saying that they had cited Esterhazy, that he was in France, he was not in London. But in fact, he was in London. And what he'd done is he apparently had a little moustache. He'd shaved it off to some form of disguise, I think. But apparently he actually was here. There was proof that he was here, that she spoke to him, that she got the confession. And in 1899, Esterhazy admitted his lies and Dreyfus was released. And this was due largely to her absolute persistence. And of course, then she was fated in Fleet Street of having this most fantastic scoop. Now, by October 1896, there's that's the articles in the Observer that we do have. We have first-class evidence that it actually happened. By October 1896, Frederick it seemed, had been diagnosed with syphilis. And, you know, when you think about it, he got married at 30, and there is another talk I give when we talk about the young men having a gay old time when they were young, running around Paris and Berlin and having just a marvellous time. And what is always surprising is that whether he knew he had it or not, probably did, and they never seemed to tell the wife. And then, of course, what happened, Rachel contracted it as well. So he died in November 1903. Frederick had left Rachel everything, but she was so overtaken with grief that she basically had a nervous breakdown. It is also suggested that by this time she was probably in the secondary stage of syphilis, which can obviously make you very, very ill. But within a month, she was declared insane, judged to have become mentally unstable by George Savage, who was the same doctor who had diagnosed Virginia Woolf as insane a few years later. I sort of put that in because I'm not quite sure about him, because I never really thought of Virginia Woolf as actually insane. These poor women were terribly depressed. So she was stripped of her right to manage her own property. Her husband's will she refused to submit to the court so that it could be proven or validated, so the inheritance could pass to her. The Sassoons, who had not been in contact with her for at least 14 years, if not more, became the heirs to Frederick's fortune. Rachel had the right to file a response against the inquiry, which had ended up in the certification of insanity, but she did not do a thing. She did not do a thing, which is really sad considering how she had been so fervent with her work, but she'd obviously just either given up or was just too sick to care. And not even her last request to be buried with her husband was honoured, which again I find is really very emotional. And Rachel's estate was left to her nephew, Sigrid Sassoon, who also, it's recorded, didn't think very much of her, didn't go to visit her, and was often rather rude about her. But the worst thing as well, I mean, that was bad enough, but in April 1927, the obituaries in the Observer and the Sunday Times were pithy to a degree. They were just a couple of lines. And I think that is just appalling. But the Sunday Times anniversary, 200th anniversary in 2022, they remembered her and feted her, and there are a lot of articles about her, but all rather too late. But it is good, of course, is that she can and now be remembered, and you can obviously find lots and lots of editorial about her. She was buried in Tunbridge Wells. Let's have a look. I've got some pictures here. Yes, there we go. We have the wonderful mausoleum for the Beer family in Highgate Cemetery. And Rachel was buried. There seems to be nobody seems to be able to agree. They suggest that she was buried in Brighton, but actually the proof is in the pudding, is it not? She was actually buried at the cemetery in Tunbridge Wells, where she had been living for many years. And in 2020, a new marker, I'm afraid I could only find this old photograph that I could actually use legally. The other ones belong to the newspapers. But now it's been completely refurbished, and it has another marker here, which was paid for by the Observer and the Sunday Times, which says that she was the first lady editor of Fleet Street. So finally, she has been recognised. And just as an afterword, and I hope I've got this right, in 1905, get this right in a minute, executors of Frederick Beer's will sold the Observer to a certain gentleman called Alfred Harmsworth, later Lord Northcliffe, which of course is connected with the house. Now, I got a lot of my information from this book, The First Lady of Fleet Street by Eilert Negev, who sent me an email on Monday, and I thought, oops. I'm in for a lawsuit here because I've used his title. But no, he was really very, very sweet, and he said I hoped it all went well, and he just wanted to know what questions were asked about her, which I will hopefully report back to him if we have any. But I do recommend it, and I think the pair of them, a bit like me, I got very emotionally involved. And I think I sometimes need to step back a little bit. But unfortunately, there is not a lot of first-hand evidence. I don't know what the Sassoons did with Frederick's and Rachel's paperwork, but there just doesn't seem to be any that anyone has come forward with. Perhaps it was burnt, perhaps it was all destroyed. I know a lot of their things were just sold off because they were a bit sort of eclectic collectors. So it's really quite hard for people to find out more about what was actually going on with the kind of dynamic with the families. But I think she very much deserves being recognised again, and hopefully you will tell your friends about her or look her up a bit more. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to me. I'm very happy to answer any questions.
I'm sure there are some questions. Does anyone want to start? Yes.
The stigma of syphilis, is that the reason why, obviously, she was shunned by...
No, she was not. The syphilis had nothing to do with her being shunned. She was shunned by her family because she became a Christian. She was a Jewess, and because her husband had taken the Anglican faith, she then decided that she would become an Anglican too. And that's why her family shunned her. It was just perhaps a step too far for them, that she was no longer part of their community. Although, interestingly, it's usually the women are allowed to marry out of the faith, and correct me anyone here if I'm wrong, it's the men, because basically what happens is their children are assumed or will be follow the Jewish faith, whether they're Christians or not, their children will follow the Jewish faith. But it's interesting again, you know, as you all know, when you pick up a subject or you get interested in something, you get somebody's view, you read about that and you think, oh yeah, that's just amazing. And then you go off and you read and someone's got a completely different take on it. And, you know, even the review of this book, a lot of people have said that they've just got far too emotionally involved. They talk far too much about the history of the Sassoons and the Beers. But actually that's where everybody came from. And I think it's so important. And the fact that, you know, they were Judeo-Arabic, I mean, that to me is just absolutely stunning. And then the Frankfurt Jews. So you've got these two extraordinary families coming together. And it's just but there is not a lot of evidence about, I don't know what the archives are like at the Observer and the Sunday Times, but these people who spent a lot of time researching it just didn't seem to be able to get hold of enough. Primary sources. I've been searching for that since I started talking. Primary sources. Any other questions? Sorry.
Did Rachel and Frederick have any children?
No, she had no children. No, they were too busy, I think, and probably he couldn't by then.
What were the Sassoons' connections with England before they moved over? Why did they move?
There were none.
So how did that happen? It's a big move.
I think they felt that they'd probably spent, they'd been in the whole family, they'd been there for 40 years in India. And it was probably, they decided that it was probably the time to move into Europe. I mean, they didn't really have to work anymore. And I think probably what they liked the idea of was maybe joining society, basically progressing. And they were very well received. You know, they entertained royalty and, you know, and people allow you to assume sometimes, I think, when you read books, maybe novels or see films, that, you know, wealthy Jews were shunned, as the gentleman said, but no, they were, you know, the Rothschilds as well. And they were always they all were very generous with their money in terms of charitable giving and so on. And interestingly, the Rothschilds are the ones who never seem to throw anything away. Because Waddesdon Manor is absolutely full of things like wine labels and 17th century invitations. And I mean, you know, and then you've got the others, I don't know about the Sassoons, but the Beers you seem to have, maybe they just didn't collect these things. But no, I have a feeling they left, well, they did leave India because they'd made their wealth. And probably David decided that for the rest of the children to marry well, and to move up in society. And it's usually, I think, in that period, that's what people wanted to do.
What did they base their material? The material the book was based on. What was that?
Well, they obviously did have records of the Sassoon family in Baghdad and in India. And but what I'm saying really about the primary sources, there's not a lot about Frederick and Rachel, which is to me is quite odd, that maybe the family, the Sassoons, decided that they would destroy it all, because that's where they were unable to get some more background information. But they do have a good bibliography at the back. But again, it is, I mean, I cried several times in the book, and at the end I was sobbing, because I just thought, oh. And they write in an emotional way as well. But no, I still though have to take it a bit with a pinch of salt. And of course, the Dreyfus affair is very well documented, and yeah, and I can't remember all the chapters in the book, but I have to say it was a really good read, absolutely fascinating, from the Jewish society, women in society, and of course the newspaper business. In the city, in London as well.
With her role as the editor, she wrote the column. She wrote the one column.
She wrote her world's view. She didn't write the whole newspaper. She had her office at home, and then she would have had where the Sunday Times was printed, and she would have had editors. She did have editors who would have been. It wouldn't just be like her own personal day-to-day diary sort of thing. But she had her own column, and I would imagine she would have had a say-so at what went in, because interestingly, she encouraged her journalists to, talk about the poor and working conditions. But William Stead got fired because he actually did an article on child prostitution, and for Rachel, it was a step too far. He'd encouraged her to write, about everything and anything, but that one point, quite an interesting part of the book, she couldn't, that was, in common parlance, too much in your face, if you like. And I don't know if it even exists, that article anymore, but...
Just in your research on the Sassoons, do you come across mention of them involved in the E&O Hotel in Penang? And probably the record?
No, just to explain, I didn't do the research on the Sassoons. I've taken a lot of my information from this book, and also from, dare I say it, Wikipedia, and other journalists writing about the family, and also about their burial records and where they lived. I personally did not study the Sassoons, and I don't know if anyone's ever written a book about them. There's quite a lot about the Rothschilds. I believe there's actually a new series coming out soon about the Rothschilds, with that chap who did that famous, is it Downton Abbey? Yes, he's working with Ian Kelly on doing something about the Rothschilds. But they're very, a lot of these families are very isolated, really. They keep themselves to themselves. But the Penang Tower sounds interesting. Do you want to tell us about it?
I think there's an involvement with the Sassoon. I think the Sassoon family at Long Beach Park.
How old is the Penang Tower?
No, the E&O Hotel.
I'm sorry, I beg your pardon.
Eastern and Oriental Hotel.
Oh, right. Okay, sorry.
And the Raffles Hotel, I think they were open by...
Oh, I'm going to go home and look that up, because that definitely, I like Raffles. Yeah, we'll have a look. Maybe they invested. Probably, because they were around there, weren't they?
Yes, quite a few.
Around that part of the world.
People did go to places like Malaysia. Because
Of course.
who was also...
Well, I know his brothers went all over the place, and I know that the Rothschilds did the same thing, but in Europe, so that they were in all the major countries and cities. And, the Rothschilds were just extraordinarily clever, how they all managed the family and always seemed to have the first news of everything. I think they were the first people who knew we'd won the Battle of Waterloo. There's a bit of a gossip. They knew. You mean the hairdresser? I don't think so. There's probably a lot of Sassoons around now, but he might be. And Siegfried Sassoon he's dead. He had a son. His son went to live on the island of Mull with his mother. The beautiful house that Siegfried bought went to rack and ruin. And, it's the way it goes, isn't it?
That's my question. How successful was the paper at the time? Did she have to hide her name? Was it popular for women?
I believe so. I didn't actually look at the distribution. That seems far too statistical to me. But I believe it was successful, yes, and the Observer.
She didn't have to hide her name, so it was okay for people to read.
Oh no, she would have been noted as the editor. Yes.
And did the
The
model-
proprietor, basically, as
Did the
well.
model in the paper or the structure of how they used to write change when the brothers took over?
No, they didn't. They sold
They
it.
just continued.
They sold it on. Fred, as I said to the gentleman, the Harmsworths, who became Lord Northcliffe, and then of course they helped support this house as well.
Bought this house to open it as a museum in 1911. Cecil Harmsworth was a brother.
So that's how the paper. That's what the paper would have looked like. That's how it was. That's obviously articles, parts of it, how it was written. And I know you can go and see them. I think they're not at the London Metropolitan Archives, are they? I can't remember where the newspapers went. You used to go somewhere really obscure to go and read all the newspapers. Yes, thank you everyone. Thank you. I know you've all probably got to go back to work.
Yes, the nature of a lunchtime lecture, I'm afraid. Thank you for coming. Well, I'm sure Tina will be welcome to take questions afterwards more individually, but it was really fascinating to learn about the tenacity, the talent and the absolute tragedy that was the life of Rachel Beer. It's been very educational. So thank you, Tina. Tina also wears another hat. So if you're interested in the more Georgian-centric experience, she's also the founder of a company called the Georgian Dining Academy, which regularly holds events here at the house and elsewhere. So do follow what Tina Baxter's up to and what we're doing at the house. But could you just join me in thanking her for today's illuminating lecture? Thank you. Thank you.